Easter Sunday, 1478. Inside Florence's cathedral, the moment the priest raises the host, the knives come out. Giuliano de' Medici is stabbed to death at the altar. His brother Lorenzo escapes with a wound to the neck. The plot had one very unusual backer, the Pope himself. Every family that builds something lasting eventually asks the same question. Not how do we get rich, how do we make sure it survives us? The Medici answered that question 3 different times, in 3 different centuries, using 3 completely different tools: money, blood, and paint. Only one of those tools was still standing by the end, and the family didn't fully understand which one it was until it was almost too late. This is the story of what actually survives when a fortune collapses completely, and what a Renaissance banking family accidentally proved about the real difference between wealth and power. Florence, the final years of the 1300s. The city runs on wool and cloth. Its textile guilds set prices, settle disputes, and hold more real day-to-day power over ordinary life than most European kings ever did. Somewhere in that world is Giovanni de' Medici, a banker with no title and no army, who in 1397 opens a small banking house on a street named for the wool guild itself. He has no family fortune to speak of yet, and no political office. He has one real strategic idea: cultivate the church as a client, patiently, before anyone else in the city thinks to. It will take his family exactly 13 years to turn that idea into control of the Vatican's own treasury. In 1410, a cardinal named Baldassare Cosa wanted the papacy. Getting there took money, buying support, buying votes, effectively buying the office of cardinal itself, years earlier. Giovanni de' Medici had supplied that money. It paid off. Cosa was elected, taking the name John the 23rd. Most of Europe recognized him as Pope. History would later demote him to anti-Pope, one of 3 men claiming the office during a schism that had split the church for decades. But in 1410, none of that mattered. He held the keys, and he owed Giovanni a debt. He repaid it the only way that mattered. He made the Medici Bank the Depositario Generale of the Apostolic Chamber, the official manager of the papacy's own money. Every bishop in Europe now had a reason to bank with the Medici. Every diocese paying its dues to Rome could do it through a local Medici branch, instead of shipping coin across the continent. The Medici were not the biggest bank in Florence when this happened. They were not even the most established. They were simply the only one who had bet on the right cardinal at the right moment. Within 2 decades, that single bet had grown into branches in Rome, Venice, Geneva, and briefly Naples. By the time Cosimo took over the business in the 1430s, the network reached Pisa, Milan, Lyon, Bruges, and London, each branch run with its own local management, insulated from the others, so a bad year in one city couldn't sink the whole institution. It was, in effect, one of the first true holding companies in European history. And the Rome office, the one handling the church's money, generated more profit than every other branch combined. Money like that bought more than commercial advantage. In 1433, rival families inside Florence's own government had Cosimo arrested and exiled from the city. A year later, he was recalled, and from that point on, he ran Florence without ever holding a formal title for it. He built a web of loans, favors, and quiet alliances that rewarded his friends and financially strangled his rivals, one at a time, until nobody in the city could outmaneuver him. Decades later, Pope Pius II summed up exactly what Cosimo had built in a single line. He was, in the Pope's own words, king in everything but name. And Cosimo didn't stop at politics. He funded the rebuilding of the Dominican monastery of San Marco, brought in the architect Michelozzo to redesign it, and filled its walls with frescoes by the painter Fra Angelico. Inside that same monastery, he established one of the first public libraries in Europe, open to any scholar who wanted to use it. It was money spent with no obvious commercial return at all. What it bought instead was quieter and more permanent. The growing sense, spreading through Florence, that the Medici name belonged somewhere near holiness itself, long before a single Medici ever wore a mitre. Here is the problem the family had to solve next. The Catholic Church considered charging interest a mortal sin, usury. The kind of sin that supposedly got you burned in the next life, the money bag still hanging around your neck. But merchants needed credit. Kings needed credit. Popes needed credit. So, Florentine bankers built a workaround, and the Medici perfected it. The letter of exchange. Instead of loaning 100 florins and demanding 110 back, a Medici branch would issue a note payable in a different city, in a different currency. The profit on paper was a currency exchange margin, not interest, nothing to confess. To depositors, they didn't pay interest either. They paid a gift, discretionary, never written into any contract, a present, given out of pure gratitude that happened to arrive every single year, in an amount that happened to resemble interest almost exactly. Theologians argued about this for decades. Some accepted it, since real currency risk was involved, meaning the return wasn't guaranteed, meaning it wasn't technically usury. Others weren't convinced at all. In 1429, Florence settled the argument the hard way. The city banned the riskiest version of the technique outright, calling it what it looked like, usury wearing a disguise. Some historians believe the law was aimed less at the practice itself, and more at one family's growing financial power. It didn't matter. By 1435, the law was quietly repealed. The Medici had already become too large and too useful to the city's own government to legislate away. Then, in 1461, in the hills northwest of Rome, workers discovered something that would matter even more: massive deposits of alum, a mineral essential to dyeing wool and cloth, which was, at the time, Europe's single biggest industry. There was only one problem. Almost all of Europe's alum came from Ottoman territory, and there was no substitute for it. Without it, dye simply washed out of cloth. Buying it meant sending good Christian money straight to the empire that had just captured Constantinople. Pope Pius II saw an opportunity that was both financial and religious at once. He declared trading in Turkish alum an offense against Christendom itself, and directed the profits from the new Tolfa mines toward funding a crusade against the Turks. His successor, Pope Paul II, went even further, threatening excommunication for anyone caught buying alum from the Ottomans, and the contract to run the Tolfa trade went to Medici interests. A 9-year concession in 1466, renewed again in 1471 for 4 more years. One surviving document from June of 1461 even granted Piero di Cosimo de' Medici the right to export and sell alum anywhere in the world, free of the usual docking fees. Nobody could question a monopoly framed as a holy cause. Competing with it wasn't simply bad business. It was aiding the enemies of the faith. For 3 decades, one family sat at the center of a resource every dyer, weaver, and cloth merchant in Europe needed, protected by the one authority nobody in Christendom could overrule. But that same authority could turn on you completely. Which brings us back to that Easter morning in the cathedral. Lorenzo de' Medici had spent years blocking Pope Sixtus IV from expanding papal territory into a region called the Romagna. The Pope wanted the Medici Bank to help finance the purchase of a strategically placed city there. Lorenzo refused. The plotter's first plan was to kill Lorenzo during a visit to Rome. He canceled the trip without knowing why, and the plan fell apart before it began. So, the Pope's own nephew, Girolamo Riario, joined forces with the rival Pazzi banking family and the Archbishop of Pisa to try again, this time inside Florence itself. The plan: kill both Medici brothers during Sunday Mass, then seize the city's government within the hour. Half of it worked. Giuliano died at the altar. Lorenzo survived, and Florence did not rise up against him. It rose up for him. The response was brutal and immediate. More than 80 people connected to the plot were executed. Conspirators were hanged from the windows of the city's own town hall, left there as a public warning. The Pope excommunicated the entire city, and war followed with Naples, an ally of the plotters. Florence kept governing anyway. A year later, Lorenzo did something almost nobody expected. He sailed to Naples himself, walked into the court of a king whose armies were actively fighting his city, and negotiated peace face to face. It worked. He came home to a hero's welcome. The papacy, the same institution the family had spent 70 years cultivating, bankrolling, and marrying into, had just tried to have them murdered inside a cathedral. The lesson Lorenzo took from that wasn't to retreat from the church. It was that access to that world needed a different kind of foundation, not something rented through a bank account. something owned through blood and reputation. So no single pope could ever turn against the family that completely again. So Lorenzo doubled down on two fronts at once. The first was culture. He drew Florence's best artists directly into his own household. Sandro Botticelli, a young Leonardo da Vinci, and starting around 1490, a teenage sculptor named Michelangelo Buonarroti, who moved into the Medici palace itself, studying the family's collection of ancient sculpture, eating at the same table as Lorenzo's own sons and his nephew Giulio. 2 decades earlier, the family had already tested exactly this idea in paint. Inside the private chapel of their own palace, the painter Benozzo Gozzoli filled an entire wall with a fresco of the 3 wise men traveling toward Bethlehem around 1459. Woven into that royal procession, alongside kings and saints, were the actual faces of the Medici family themselves. Anyone walking into that chapel for the next 5 centuries would see the Medici standing exactly where they wanted to be seen, shoulder to shoulder with sacred history. None of this was simple charity. Every fresco, every sculpture, every classical bust in that collection said the same thing without a single word. These people belong among history's greatest patrons, right alongside popes and emperors. It was reputation, built in paint and marble, one commission at a time. The second front was the church itself. In 1489, Lorenzo secured a cardinal's hat for his own second son, Giovanni, who was 13 years old at the time. Giovanni was formally installed as cardinal in 1492, the same year his father died. It wasn't the only door Lorenzo built into Rome that decade. Around 1487, his daughter Maddalena married Franceschetto Saibo, the son of Pope Innocent VIII himself, tying the Medici directly into a reigning pope's own family. A marriage and a cardinal's hat, arranged within 2 years of each other. 2 different routes into the same building. A bank account can be seized. A monopoly contract can be revoked by the next pope who takes the throne. But a son sitting inside the College of Cardinals is a foothold that no single enemy can simply legislate away. That teenage boy, sharing a table with the future Michelangelo, was Giovanni de' Medici. In 21 years, the world would know him as Pope Leo X. But first, the machine behind everything had to stop. Under Cosimo, every branch of the bank had operated with real independence and real accountability. Under his son and grandson, that discipline slipped badly. Loans went out to kings and princes with no real intention or no real ability to repay them. Branch managers operated with less and less oversight from Florence. The bank's own general manager, Francesco Sassetti, let the Bruges branch extend enormous unsecured loans to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Money that became uncollectible the moment the Duke was killed in battle in 1477. By the early 1490s, Lorenzo himself was quietly diverting Florentine state funds just to keep the family bank from collapsing outright. In 1494, it collapsed anyway. The bank was formally liquidated. That same year, a French army swept through Italy, and Florence turned on the family that had ruled it in all but name for 60 years. Piero de' Medici, Lorenzo's son, was driven out of the city he had inherited. An institution that had run continuously for 97 years, that had once served as personal banker to the Pope of Rome himself, ended in liquidation and exile within the same 12 months. What survived wasn't a balance sheet, it was a name. 19 years after the bank collapsed, and 19 years after the family was driven from its own city, Giovanni de' Medici, that teenage cardinal from the Pazzi years, was elected pope. He took the name Leo X in 1513. There was no Medici bank left anywhere to fund his papacy. What got him there was everything else: the family name, the decades of alliances, and a reputation for greatness that a generation of painters and sculptors had built directly into the culture of Europe. Leo X spent lavishly to finish St. Peter's Basilica, funding part of the work by selling indulgences across the continent, paid certificates that promised to reduce a buyer's time, suffering in purgatory after death. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published 95 formal objections to exactly that practice, nailed, according to tradition, to a church door in Wittenberg. It became one of the sparks that lit the Protestant Reformation, a religious split that would divide Europe for the next century. 10 years after Leo's election, A second Medici took the papal throne. Giulio de' Medici, the same cousin who had once shared Lorenzo's table as a boy, became Pope Clement VII in 1523. He commissioned Michelangelo, the same artist who had once lived inside his family's household as a teenager, to paint the Last Judgment across the altar wall of the Sistine Chapel. 2 popes, 0 functioning banks, 1 family name that had somehow outlived the very fortune that built it. Here is what actually happened, laid end to end. This family had their core business model outlawed by their own city. They survived an assassination attempt, ordered by the head of the very church that had made them rich. They watched their bank, 97 years old, once personal banker to the Pope himself, collapse into total liquidation. And none of it stopped them. What stopped nothing was the fact that, at some point, the money itself had become the least important thing they owned. A monopoly contract expires. A bank can be mismanaged into the ground in a single bad decade. But a name woven into a fresco beside the 3 wise men, a face painted among the saints, a son placed inside the College of Cardinals since he was 13 years old, none of that gets liquidated. It compounds in a completely different currency. Most families spend their money trying to make more money. The Medici, without ever fully planning it, spent theirs trying to become unforgettable. Only one of those 2 things survived long enough to reach the papacy. Nobody in 1397 could have designed this outcome on purpose. Giovanni de' Medici was solving one narrow problem. How does a banker with no title get a foothold with the church? Nobody could have told him that the eventual payoff, 116 years later, wouldn't be a bigger bank at all. It would be his own great-great-grandson's face, painted into the history of the church itself. By the time Clement VII sat for his official portrait as Pope, the bank that had started everything had already been gone for nearly 30 years. Nobody in that room was thinking about letters of exchange or alum contracts or a debt owed by an anti-pope back in 1410. They were looking at a Medici. That was the entire point. Giovanni de' Medici never lived to see a member of his family wear the papal tiara. He lived just long enough to teach his son one lesson, whether he meant to or not: build something people will remember, because the money always runs out eventually. Reputation, once it's real, is the one currency that never does.